So this presentation is about expanding medical devices into digital tools to create new user experiences. So what does that mean? In general, this kind of falls into two big buckets, right? You have, I'll call it the traditional medical device, and then you start having these tools that may start off as non-medical devices and then evolve into medical devices. So in the industry, we kind of break these into two categories where we call them smart connected devices. I take a device, I add connectivity to it, I have an app, and I have other digital solutions that gets applied to it. But then we have this all other category that's purpose-made to be medical, which is it's never been a medical device before. And these are the areas that ends up being typically, right, software-only devices or SAMD, right, software as a medical device. So I'll spend most of the time on the purpose-made medical devices, but it's important to kind of talk about the smart devices a little bit. So most of you, right, for the medical devices that you have, especially if you're with a company that's been making medical devices for a long time, for decades, right, regardless of what type of device it is, eventually want to start generating insights from that device. You might want to start running algorithms on that device. There's always a lot of use cases you have for data, and that's never a bad thing. So the way that's typically done, you add some connectivity to your device, you get data from your device, you build an app, you connect to the EHR, right? You have maybe some app that you gave to the patient because the patient likes to monitor their care. So this whole group of connected devices also requires a slightly different perspective from a usability or human factors engineering, because it's no longer just the device, it's now a ecosystem. It's a system of systems. And I'll show one example on the next slide for what I think is a very unique situation of a smart connected device. What I'll talk more about here is these purpose-made devices. So these are typically those SAMD devices. Abby was talking about AI, so these are a lot where AI algorithms, and it's not always AI algorithms. There's a lot of other insights that can be provided. Earlier on, right, someone was talking about proctoring. So there's telemedicine, teleproctoring. You see this gets applied too. And there's a whole class of software apps called digital therapeutics, which is basically apps that are treated as drugs and actually go through clinical trials as drugs themselves. So this whole area of purpose-made devices is really an emerging area that, for me, someone who kind of grew up in a Star Trek generation, it's what I've always been waiting for. Right? So I'll give one nice example. When I ran across this example, one, it surprised me. I don't think we have anyone from Zimmer here, so I won't insult anyone from Zimmer. So this is a unique application of taking a purely mechanical device, a knee implant, and making it a smart connected device. So your knee implant now can transmit data, right, to a router that's in your home, and then it transmits that data both to a doctor's portal and to an app for the patient. So shown on the screen are some of the measurements, some of the data that's actually recorded from that smart knee. Now, from a human factors perspective, the thing that's very interesting, because I've run into this firsthand at both Zeiss and Proximie, is not so much anything related to the knee implant. It's not also nothing related to the app, right? UX folks know how to design mobile apps and customer portals. But one area that you may not always think about is that middle box, that router, that black box that's now in the patient's home that has to connect to their Wi-Fi. Now, maybe it has 5G and that simplifies the connectivity, but you have this workflow problem to address that, especially if you were working at Zimmer and working on a knee device, right? It's not a use scenario you've ever had to think about. So as you start having these devices that expand and start having connectivity, uh, the user environment, right, we were talking about earlier, becomes more important. And there's nothing more complex about the user environment than actual Wi-Fi connectivity, Bluetooth connectivity, and so forth. And then the other issue I put up there on the screen, I so want to move over there and talk and get away from this podium, is the value. There were some discussions earlier around kind of the value proposition, which is the outcome. And almost all digital tools try to drive the same value, right? Better patient outcomes, a reduction in costs, right? A reduction in hospital cost, and that typically you get that through reduced time, whether the patient is in the hospital, reduced time from the patient having to be readmitted to the hospital, or reduce surgical time. So how do you get from having that app that collects this data to generating these insights to say you're achieving that goal? And that's an area that then UX, right, also plays into. So you have this data, but now you have this visualization of that data, and a visualization of that data that's going to generate those insights. Who's going to do that, right? Who is the person best qualified to visualize data to generate insights? Now, it's no longer the doctor necessarily who's visualizing this, right? It could be a hospital admin. It could be someone else at the hospital who's looking at that data. Because sometimes some of this data is maintenance data, right? It could be a biomed at the hospital. So it gets into, it's no longer a primary kind of point of care device. It's no longer a device that's there necessarily to drive diagnosis or treatment or prevention of a disease, but it is a device here to generate data that's going to get visualized, that someone's actually going to look at and generate some insights and do something with it. So your role expands beyond, right, the core device itself, because for those insights to be usable, right, it has to be usable, right? It's not, here's a bunch of data, here's a Tableau dashboard, go do something with it, right? If I give you a ton of tables and a ton of charts and graphs, you're just going to look at it and do nothing with it, and it sits unused. And that's a general theme I'll come back to, and it's one of the reasons actually most medtech startups in the healthcare space, why they fail. I'll talk a little bit about that in the next few slides. So let's now jump into purpose-made devices. And I'll take you through a little timeline of past, present, and future in this, primarily from the perspective of why most of these people failed. And UX is actually a big reason why they failed. So Abby, I think, worked at Philips. So that picture may look familiar up there. But remote patient monitoring, right, having these digital tools where at remote sites, people will look at data, has been around for 15, 20 years. Telemedicine companies like Teladoc and others, where they would have these devices that allowed treatment at a hospital without a doctor being there, that's been around for years. Devices, especially in rehabilitation, where you can be home and be treated, and rehabilitation program could be changed and adapted based on what you were doing. That's been around for years. All of these devices have limited success. Now, a company like Teladoc may disagree with me when I say limited success, right? They're $1 billion company. During COVID, right, their stock went up like crazy. After COVID, the stock went down like crazy. And the big reason is, yes, The environment like COVID may actually drive adoption because there was no other option. But when you see that adoption drop, right, when that external restriction goes away, that tells you there's some inherent problem with the device. Now, I actually have a lot of interaction with Teladoc directly because, so when I work with Proximy, we actually partnered with Teladoc. So we got to see some of the issues firsthand. And the number one problem when we spoke to the hospitals had to deal with the usability of it. Now, this is not the Teladoc cart on there. This is from another company, but they're all pretty similar. It's a cart you have to wheel in typically the general care flow, but they're also used in the ICU, and we were adapting them to be used within the OR. But if you can look at bringing in this device, right, it typically has to be cleaned after every use, and then it either has to be stored somewhere, right? They're not kept in the OR during surgery. So you have this part of the workflow that's not your primary, any of your primary use scenarios by far, but it is the number one reason why the adoption hasn't been there. It's why the nurses and the techs do not like using it, right? So once you start getting into these digital tools and devices, the implementation of the device, right? The device getting into the OR, being set up in the OR, being torn down, those are real blockers. Has nothing to do with safety, has nothing to do with regulatory compliance, has nothing to do with design controls, has everything to do whether a company is going to be financially successful with that product. And when it comes to digital, so I live in Northern California, UX rules the world, right? Nobody starts a product without UX. No decision happens without UX. So UX are king of everything when you look at digital products in California. And the understanding is that, yes, user experience actually makes a product. It's actually sometimes more important than the functionality of the product itself. So I caught out in the beginning, right, 10, 20 years ago, and a little bit of where we are then today. So lower left, that's Proximy. That's the company I used to work for. So what they make is that software platform for teleproctoring, telementoring on the OR. So basically stream audio, video annotations, unlimited. Remote doctors can join in and help proctor a live surgery. But on those platforms, there are others that then generate additional insights. Insights around the time of the surgery, insights around amount of bleeding, right? So they're running algorithms for amount of bleeding, generate insights into the use of the device, what type of the device, the placement of the device. So there are a lot of these insights that are generated. And today they're typically used to train new doctors. They used to train doctors on new medical devices, but they're also kind of used to train actually new doctors starting surgery the first time. There's a lot of published data out there that most adverse events and deaths are caused by new doctors. It's why you actually never want to undergo surgery with a doctor with less than 10 years experience. Your chance of something bad happening is significantly higher. So there's a lot of effort in the industry to improve that training, accelerate that training that's out there. So when you start looking then at these applications, right, they're primarily today used as a training tool. So what is going to make this training tool more effective? It is the user experience, right, of that interface. Proximy themselves spent 1.5 years not developing a single new feature to completely redo the application around the user interface and user experience. They went from effectively 1 person to a 6-person team, a small startup in that 1.5 years, really focused only on the user experience because that was a blocker for them. The other applications on there, the one on the upper left is actually from a J&J acquisition called CSATs. In that application, it's other doctors and the open source and the open community basically review your surgical procedure and provide comments and insights into how well or poorly certain things happened in that procedure. So imagine you're building effectively a YouTube for surgical procedures. And again, these applications are not medical device applications, right? Based on that intended use, they're not going to get classified as a medical device. So none of the human factors work you're doing there are going to be regulated. But 100% of that is super valuable, right, to any hospital looking to get the skill sets of the surgeon trained up in the shortest amount of time, because they know the adverse events, the bad things that happen, the deaths that happen are from that learning curve of new surgeons on there. And those interfaces, again, is where human factors engineers spend a lot of time, because for these tools to be utilized, right, you guys know about stickiness, right? Surgeons have to use them. You have to make it sticky. You have to make it frictionless. So those two key aspects of the human factors design in general, right? I'm not talking about medical device, because medical device, we care about use errors. Here we care about, right, the stickiness and being a frictionless design, because for the surgeons to use it, you have to make it easy for them to be in the application and spend the time in the application, whether it's their own videos or whether it's a proctor who's there to actually guide someone else. So this is kind of today how these tools exist. But then let's talk a little bit about what I say is tomorrow. And I call it tomorrow, even though these products that you're seeing on the screen actually do exist today. So training itself, it covers some of the topics that we kind of just heard in simulation, which is good training is almost like a good simulation, right? It has to be authentic. I can have a surgeon and I can have them trained in the OR with actual patients and with a proctor, but I can actually accelerate that training by using augmented reality and virtual reality. Because when it's a live training, there's only a certain number of cases, there's only certain variability in that patient, certain variability into the complications you might run into that you're going to get exposed to. But with augmented reality training, you can accelerate that. You can have something they kind of call personalized training, which is for every individual doctor, right? You can have different complications, different types of cases, different criteria, and basically have them kind of go through that experience on their own. And there is some data, right, to support that this type of training does accelerate their learning curve. Now, to build this type of AR training, we get into almost some exact same criteria we just talked about with good simulated environments for summative evaluations. The term that you'll see used a lot here is called digital twins. So it's a term that started in other industries. You see it in automotive, semiconductor, oil and gas industries, areas where it was not possible to always have the real devices being the real location, but a normal simulation will not be authentic enough, or a normal simulated model will not be authentic enough. So really what a digital twin is, it tries to mimic all the behaviors of the real device. Now, there are some very complicated digital twins where you operate in a simulation and then behind the scenes there's actually something real. But for us in the med device space, it typically translates into much more complex models. Everything about the texture of the bone, the skin, the amount of leakage on the blood, the complications, the wrong sealant time of a electrosurgical device. So all of those criteria can be simulated in the augmented reality. All of that haptic feedback is simulated. And because everything kind of is personalized training towards you, you can actually progress in different levels of complicated surgeries. And you have your own dashboard with your scores, and you even have certifications and different criteria embedded in it. So just this training program expands to a whole kind of app software ecosystem that's all driven um, by UX. So you see more of this now in robotic surgeries, where a lot of the robotic surgical systems, you have to go through training certifications, and their training devices that are used. Those training devices are big, right? They're expensive. So one area you see this getting a lot of adoption these days is actually in the robotic surgical system, because it does really accelerate that certification program. So let's talk a little bit about safety. Ed was talking about labeling. There's been a lot of talk about IFUs and so forth. And this is an area I'm probably gonna upset a few people. So when it comes to IFU and labeling, and even that training in general, like there are certain medical devices like robotics where training is required. You have to have the certification program, you have to have the training program. There's no way around it. There's a lot of medical devices where it's going to be completely up to you if training is required. There's sometimes a conflict where you have where training is required. You may have your marketing team where they may want certain training, right? Just because I do training doesn't mean it's training. And I'll talk about that distinction of training versus training in a second. And then you have things your sales team may want in training. So unfortunately, the word training gets kind of used interchangeably, but there is an official definition, right, of training. So I always like to point back to the standards, because if you understand the standards, it's your best friend, right? So in the human factors world, I always encourage people, do not just read your SOPs. The people who wrote your SOPs, very unlikely knows nothing about what you do, right? So make sure you're knowledgeable enough in what the standards actually say. So for human factors, I think folks have covered the big two, which is risk management, which is 4971 and 62366-1, right? So you better know those inside and out, because there's a lot of stuff folks do, like I heard a sample size of 15 and a few other things that you don't have to do for human factors. Okay, so training is something that there's only one document that ever says what training is required. That's risk. Risk is the only thing that says is training required or not, right? If your risk says training is not required, then it's not required. You can still provide it, but it's not required training. So you don't have to do things around summative evaluations. You don't have to do things like validations. You don't have to do anything about it because your risk said it's not required. Now, there are going to be things in there you do have to do it about, because there's other standards like 20417, which talks about things that has to be in your IFU. Now, the nice thing is it doesn't say your IFU has to be a printed document. Luckily, right, MDR and US now allows you to have your IFU in non-printed form. So I always encourage my TechCom teams to not use printed documentation, not use PDFs for IFUs. So when it comes to a labeling perspective, right, safety is the guiding factor of one is training is required. And understanding that separation is important because it allows you to then exclude certain things from any summative evaluations that you may have to do. So be very kind of well educated in those things. Now, the last sentence on there, that gets more into the digital aspect of things. As you start looking at, right, some of these digital tools, um, the novelty of it in the sense that I have a medical device, I now have connectivity, I now have this app, I'm now implementing some AI algorithm, I'm now implementing something from an augmented reality perspective. That novelty or newness of it then sometimes does drive, right, the need for training. But that should always be reflected in risk. Remember, there's only ever one source for safety, just one, and that's your risk management file. So if anybody ever wants you to do something, you go look at a risk management file. If it's not there, then you don't do it, right? So always kind of maintain what's that source of truth, because you will have the need to generate. It's good to have training. Customers like training, sales folks like training, but whether that training is a required training, right? So that really is a differentiator. Required training versus training, right? Required training is the one that you have to fulfill all those regulatory requirements. General training, you don't. Aside from the stuff called out in 20417, that stuff you do. So a little bit about the effectiveness of training. I think a few folks cover things around like knowledge assessments and performance scores. We looked at the simulated scenarios. But the last two, I will touch on a little bit more, especially when we look at the digital world. So Abby was talking about machine learning and AI. So in the software world, if I look at the augmented reality training example, or any other kind of digital tool used for training, one of the big positives you have with these digital tools for training is you always know the effectiveness of it. So a lot of companies will bake in these training tools within the app itself, or within the app itself, you actually have feedback mechanisms. I forget who was talking about Pendo earlier on, right? There's ways to get real-time analytics back. So you always have real-time data to show how devices were being used. So how do you prove the effectiveness of your training? How do you prove the stickiness of your training? If someone needs to be retrained after some amount of time, digital actually easier to save the day because you have that real-time data you can pull back from the usage of the device. And the other thing with tools like the AR training tool or other digital tools is you release new features that gets applied to your training application, to your augmented reality kind of training tool. So as new features are released, that's just embedded within your training tool. So one of the things, yeah, we'll start seeing a lot is a big part of your time from a human factors and usability perspective is actually going to be spent on these tools because it's much more effective than bringing in customers in a customer experience center or having a training center. So J&J in Cincinnati has a large training center. At SAIS, we had another training center where we brought in surgeons. Aside from the cost perspective, the effectiveness of these augmented reality training tools are much higher. And because it's personalized, each surgeon can kind of progress at their own pace, different levels of difficulty. And as new features are released, new versions of your devices, you're not having to retrain, right? That's all in the tools that they have already. And then one final thing I'll talk about is safety. But I'll talk about safety. Actually, I lied. Two things. Maybe. Yes, two things. I'll talk about safety from a human factors perspective. So we mentioned earlier, right, when you have all of this data, right, there are regulations around privacy, right? You have GDPR, you have regulations around security. But a big part of those regulations have to do with these ideas, right, of data governance, have to do with security monitoring, have to do with the control of patient data. So anytime you build this ecosystem that has patient data, you also have to build in all of these tools that can monitor who accessed the system when, what did you do with the patient data, was it deleted when you had to delete it? If you get a request from an EU for a patient to delete it, how do you confirm, right, you deleted that data? So there's all of these requirements for things you have to monitor on an ongoing basis, as long as you have your app and even years after you have that app. So that means you're creating dashboards. And one of the things that impact a lot of digital companies today is this idea of scalability. So most startups in medtech space to fail for scalability reasons. Most of those companies I showed earlier today who had all of these apps, they all got the early adopters and then they got stuck, right? Sales did not grow. And it was because of scalability issues. When you start working with data and connected systems, almost everyone starts off with human in the loop. It's human managing privacy, human managing access controls, humans manually creating and deleting data, patient data, humans manually de-identifying patient data. So to solve that scalability problem, you start having to build tools that manage that work. So most of those tools are going to have dashboards. You do security monitoring, you have to have dashboards looking at access control, dashboards that look at the life cycle of what happened with that patient data, because the regulations require someone at the management level to review that data periodically. So all of a sudden, if to make that data usable, it gets back to you need a human factors engineer. So again, it's nothing to do with the core medical device, but it has to do with the ability for you to actually scale that tool, that med device tool or non-med device tool, for your company to be successful. And for you to scale, you need usable dashboards, usable applications. Even here, it's your internal security people may be looking at it, internal management people, but also when we look at the data, who are the people generating insights? A lot of times it's your marketing or product people that might be looking at some of that data to generate insights into the new features. How are they going to visualize that data? They're not going to start writing their own applications to pull out data from your databases. And if you have to come to your software development team, then you have to wait weeks or months to see the data. So within these kind of digital infrastructure, there's something called self-service. Self-service means the business owner who's interested in that data internal to your company, right? Whether it's clinical, product, or marketing, they can get the insights they need without, right, a lot of friction. So that area of generating the insights even for internal use ends up being a big focus for the human factors engineers. And then a few things at the end. I talked about friction. So kind of going back to kind of scalability a little bit is when we look at not just security and privacy, it very much is this idea that it takes human effort to do a lot of things in digital today. And reducing that friction means the tools that we build have to live within the existing workflow. You cannot make people adopt new workflows. And this is true for the OR, right? It's why all of these digital devices and tools actually fail today in the OR, because surgeons and nursing staff, they have to actually change what they're doing to interact with the software. But it's also why companies internally also fail on a digital aspect, because it takes human work that deviates from their current workflow to get that job done. And that becomes, I think, a core area that UX is ideally suited to solve. So as more and more companies move into digital, whether it's connected smart devices or purpose-built devices, whether it's on the training side or even right the SAMD side, right, the UX role is going to expand because the value to UX is well beyond what 62366 talks about. That's less than 10%, right, of the value of the UX.